Get your butts in here.
For anyone online, all they just heard was you shouting. I was like, being marked down it.
Yes,
Like an interpretive dance beat, you know, or like music beat.
yes.
Just stand by the, there we go.
Okay, let's get started with the final part of our workshop. The next talk will be James O'Brien, who will talk about a fallacy of race in medical sciences. I just hold the mic with this piece of tissue to make sure that I don't spread the virus, so don't worry about getting the mic from me. And the podium is yours, James,
All right,
please.
thank you. So I'm in the mood to debate. My friend Mary, who's in the back, and I were at the House of Commons the other day. And it was spicy. Yes. Anyway, so I'm here. I'm going to try to address race without value judgment, without morality, without intention and action, without what we should do. I have, like David Hume's philosophy of the is and what we ought to do, what is and what we ought to do paradigms. And what I'd like to do is parse race through an analytic aspect to try to understand what it is. This will piggyback, I think, in many ways with Dr. Hunter's program and others. But I'm going to stay on the what is side of this with an intention of understanding race in medicine better, because it's been a bit of a mess, as we all would probably admit. I am now emeritus faculty at National Jewish Health, which is a large lung research and clinic center in Denver, and it sees patients from all over Colorado and the United States, and an affiliate with the University of Colorado. I'm a pulmonary and a critical care physician myself. So what I'd like to do first is try to understand if race exists in nature. So the idea being that a realistic ontology of race is something that we would be able to observe. We wouldn't have to construct anything. We would just take what nature presents to us and put some conceptual aspect to it, like we do with animals and plants and et cetera, yet they're there and we don't have to construct them, we just observe them. The second part is an ontology of an abstract construct. So if we construct race socially or with an abstract, then that essentially is an anti-realist aspect of this issue, and it seems to be mainly what we've been speaking of through this conference. I'm going to just read through what the definition of a natural kind is that I put together. So a natural kind is a group of things that are characterized in a way that reflects the structure of the natural world in an observed, well-demarcated, coherent fashion, independent of human interest. Essential traits, this goes back to Aristotelian philosophy. Essentially, without these traits, a thing would not exist. So then you could understand an essence of a thing. It's the traits that are essential to make that thing gold or water or a human, etc. And then contingent traits, I'll argue, are accidental, superficial traits that really don't have projectability, meaning and for example, the color of one's skin is, you know, rather superficial, contingent, accidental trait of a human being, and it doesn't project into the future well, meaning through generations, the individual who's the object of our interest may reproduce, and that contingent trait may not persist, and yet human traits will persist, making a certain essentialism to being a human, but not necessarily essentialist to having contingent traits, you know, like how tall you are, or color of your skin, or the nature of your hair, et cetera, et cetera. A social or abstract construct is different, as we know. And I think ontologically, we'd have to admit that race does exist in that nature. We're going to assume, and I'm going to show later, that it doesn't exist in a natural kind or a natural environment or realm. But social constructivism, I put down as a definition that it posits that objects of knowledge can exist, but do not have an independent foundation outside the mental and linguistic representations that people develop about them throughout their history, and which becomes their shared reality. Now, we've briefly addressed the ontology of race. Now, I want to understand or throw out for discussion and presentation whether we can understand either of these things or know them. So existence and knowing something are different, right? From philosophy 101. So a natural kind, if it doesn't exist, we can't know it. We'll just take that as an assumption. But a social construct, yes, it exists. We all agree with that. But can we know it? This is where the instrumental discussion that Dr. Hunter put up was a little fuzzy for me, because in the sense of using race in medical science or medicine, it seems very hard to understand and target. You know, we know that race exists, or we accept race exists, but we don't know how to define it. There's very little consensus. Where a unicorn, which is an anti-realist object of knowledge, I think we would agree it's very definable. You know, it's a white horse with a horn up. It's pretty simple. Where even to define race as an anti-realist object is difficult, because it doesn't seem to have a foundation to it. That's where I'm going to go with this discussion. Let's see. Oh, and I guess part of that is that if we can't define it, it's difficult to measure. And so certainly in medical science, and even in clinical medicine, the application of medical science, we find that a measure which is a cognitive, nominal, numerical assessment given to an observation or collection of observations, it has virtues in reliability and validity, and its assessment would be consistent between observers and over time. And I think others have just shown that race is just a very unreliable variable, and whether it's valid or not, we actually don't quite understand what it represents. And then the causal relationship that our definitions of race may have with physiology of disease seems non-existent. which is very important in science of medicine, is that whatever variable we consider let's say a drug, we would expect a response in a consistent, predictable fashion for a B, which would be the effect. So the cause should come before the effect, but it should consistently and reliably occur. And first of all, there is no evidence that I could find that any race trait like skin color, consistency of hair, facial features actually bear any causal relationship to lung function or kidney function. There may be a correlation. The correlation is confounding. Even perceptually or conceptually, it's very difficult to come up with any causal relationship between race trait and lung function or kidney function or whatever function you want to talk about. So my thesis, well, before I get into that, you know, it's very fuzzy what race is and how it can be applied in medicine. But we've observed that medicine actually considers science and methods of science as to be foundational and necessary in its practices. And when I talk about medicine, I talk about the authority of medicine that includes the teaching structure, the professional societies, both in research and clinical medicine, the government, the payers of medicine. They would, when I talk about medicine, they're the authorities that demand what we're addressing. They demand the science. They're just dedicated to the science. Yet the medicine includes non-scientifically proven variables and measures, etc., in its practices. So it's this kind of odd, walks a line down between science and social and political issues. And my argument is that really they would be justified, medicine would be justified in eliminating race based on the topics that I'm going to go through. So I put up a syllogism, and medicine considers natural science necessary, foundational. Medicine gives scientific credence to race in some of its practices, but we know that race cannot play a scientific role in medicine because it doesn't exist in nature or science or the discovery of nature. So medicine would be justified to eliminate race from its scientific practices. A little obstruction there. This is the first proposition, is medicine considers natural science to be necessary and foundational. So this is just a quote from the mission of the National Institutes of Health in the United States. It's the steward of medical and behavioral scientific research for the nation, United States. Its mission is to seek fundamental knowledge about nature and behavior of living systems and the applications that knowledge the applications of that knowledge to enhance health, lengthen life, and reduce illness and disability. And another example of the fealty that medicine has to science from the American Academy of Medical Colleges. All scientific research conducted at medical schools and teaching hospitals ultimately aims to improve health and ability. Basic science research, often called fundamental bench research, provides the foundation of knowledge for the applied science that follows. Basic science also increasingly extends to behavioral and social sciences as well, which have no less profound relevance for medicine and health. And then we have the evidence-based medicine school. They put their white paper out in JAMA in November of 1992. And this is a quote from their paper. Evidence-based scientific medicine de-emphasizes intuition, unsystematic clinical experience, and pathophysiologic rationale as sufficient grounds for clinical decision-making, and it stresses the examination of scientific evidence from clinical research. But now we have an example of something, it's kind of being twisted on itself, where there are, from the same institutions that express the importance of science in medicine's practices, they include non-scientific, non-real variables, and they demand them. So the NIH asks us to mix the measures that we use in our clinical or human trials between race and ethnicity and other variables that are immutable and reliable. For example, age is a reliable measure. It changes over time, but at any given moment, it will be measured the same. Height, sex, and we would have to, now in our current environment, we'd have to say birth sex. So XY, XX with female and male anatomic, physiologic issues at birth. Gender would be a little bit more like race, as we understand now, right? Anyway, so the methods of the medical sciences is recommending it are confusing because they include these real variables and they recommend anti-real variables, which are hard to define. They still use the Office of Management and Budget, Census Bureau definitions of race and ethnicity, where in fact the Office of Management and Budget states that the categories they use are socio-political constructs and should not be interpreted as anthropological in nature. Go to the next paragraph, which is from the NIH. The research guidelines ensure that all NIH-funded clinical research will be carried out in a manner sufficient to elicit information about individuals of both sexes and genders and diverse racial and ethnic groups. It is imperative to determine whether the intervention of therapy being studied affects women or men or members of minority groups and their subpopulations differently. So we can measure women and men if we use birth sex, but measurement of minority groups, we know from this discussion, and we'll see it in the future in this discussion, how difficult it is to define minority groups, and others have established that as well. So this is an example of a New England Journal article. It's from 2000, but it's an example of multiple, examples of clinical trials that are funded by the NIH. This is called the ARDSNet trial that investigated volume of mechanical ventilation for patients with diffuse lung disease. And they were able to establish that lower lung volumes were beneficial more so than higher lung volumes. And it was an instrumental study in pulmonary and critical care medicine. But they used, these immutable, reliable, valid measures all the way down, except race. Race was included. They randomized to assure that race was equivalent in both of the arms of the trial, and they only categorized race as white, black, or Hispanic, and then other or unknown, although there were only 4 and 3 individuals in each arm in the other and unknown. But we're going to show, or if you haven't come to this conclusion already, that race is both realistically or ontologically non-existent, or it's very hard to measure. And so it's at high risk for confounding the information that we get from our clinical trials. And then we've talked about this bias. The bias article is a common article referenced in papers and discussions that suggest that race is used essentially as a biologic measure in many of our lab tests and our physiologic tests and our algorithms to decide risk for surgery or risk for transplantation, et cetera, et cetera. And I put up on the top lung function. Dr. Hunter made reference to that. What that entails really is since the early 19th century, we've measured lung function through what's called spirometry. An individual takes a deep breath, they blow through a meter, and we measure the volume of air that comes out of their lungs. Let's call that the forced expiratory volume in 1 second. Now, from that, we get an absolute number, 2.5 liters or 2.16 liters, whatever. So there is a raw number that comes out. Now, that raw number is going to be measured against reference ranges for what would be considered normal based on your age, your sex, your height, and your race. And maybe you can pick out the one that doesn't belong there. But age, we know that over time, lung function peaks at about the age of 30, then it's downhill until you die. You just readily you lose lung function over time. And that's predictable and measurable. And it's a causal relationship between age and lung function. Height. I'm going to skip over sex, but the same thing occurs between men and women, just by physiologic, environmental issues within the body. They have different normal lungs with a causal relationship shown through biologic testing. And then height is kind of speaks for itself. You're 6'4", your lungs are going to be bigger than if you're 5'2". Race, the correlation has been there that race, it seems that the average lung function for race is a little bit lower in correlative testing that's been done over centuries, actually. But first of all, the bell curves overlap so much that it hardly makes a difference. And that race is not like the other variables that we measure. We have difficulty measuring it. We have no causal relationship between race and lung function. So in essence, I would argue, and I have argued in groups through the medical community, as others have, that race doesn't belong as a causal measure of lung function that we use in spirometry. Now, everything else on this list has kind of a similar basis of race being included with the presumption that biologic race exists and is measurable. And try to show why that's not the case. So we get into, we have this conflict in medicine. We love science, we want science. Oh, we're gonna include science. Maybe it's because we neglected this, or nobody's watching, et cetera, et cetera. But believe me, the pulmonary function issue has been debated ad nauseum throughout the American Thoracic Society and European Respiratory Society. And at least in the United States, the American Thoracic Society just within the last year put out a statement suggesting race neutral measures be used to decide whether someone's lungs are normal or not normal. But they haven't been picked up by labs based on verbal discussions I've had with colleagues. So it's out there as a recommendation from the professional society that essentially uses spirometry regularly, but it hasn't quite taken hold to the best of my understanding. But that brings us to does race exist? And if it doesn't exist, we shouldn't be using it in natural medicine, natural science or medicine. What I commented here on is there's no observed well-demarcated collection of human traits between individuals that are necessary and sufficient to justify a scientific race taxonomy. Traits are clinal, which means that between individuals, they'll be subtly different. So each individual has a different tone of skin. Each individual has the shape of a nose or the shape of the eyes that may or may not be similar, but they have eyes and they have a nose and they have skin. God bless. And also the things are clinal or very gradual in changes over time, and we'll look at that in just a minute. These traits of race are contingent, like we've talked about, and they're also not continentally specific, and we'll see that in a minute. So, and then the last thing is ancestry markers are interesting because they're socially established, essentially. So there really are no race markers genetically. There's nothing that hops out and says, this is what we do to define race. This is the genome of race. So we have to define race in order to understand ancestry. And that's a circular argument that we all know. Often circular arguments are not that useful. So what I'm going to go into is the subjects of inquiry that are traditional areas to define race. One is the physical traits. The other is are there individual humans that are geographically isolated and what ancestry and genetics mean. And the geography and the ancestry and genetics kind of will blend together. They're frequently, they're just dependent on themselves. But let's look at the physical traits of race. This is the team of Minnesota Lynx, which is a WNBA team that went to the WNBA final, played the New York, I forgot New York's name. Liberty. And unfortunately, New York won. I grew up in Minnesota. But you can see the phenotype of these players, all different shades of skin color, different heights. You see probably the most pale arm in the back, and different facial features. This is a clinal issue. There's not one set of physical appearance. Now, taking, for example, skin color, we are now finding, as science advances, genetics advance, that skin tone is not necessary or sufficient to connote continental origin. So all dark skin doesn't originate in Africa, light skin doesn't originate in Sweden. It is related to the distance from the equator. And the importance here is that it's, first of all, gradual and clinal, and it's related to environmental exposure over many generations. It takes, for natural selection to occur, it takes about 30 to 50 generations at minimum, up to about 30,000 generations of reproduction. So this would be happening over hundreds of thousands of years. But there are 6 loci, genetic loci, that seem to contribute to a phenotype or express skin pigmentation. And though the expression seems to be related to closeness to the equator, the expression is higher of melanin, and that's related to protection from the sun, that we think. That, again, that the most probable cause of that. And as you move away from the equator, you can see that in this map, the skin tone gets lighter because there's not as much sun, and you need sun to create active vitamin D, place calcium into your bones so that you don't break your bones when you're 20. So there's a teleologic explanation to some of this that does not depend on continental expression of melanin in skin color or skin tone. There's another graph. It's a triangular graph which shows it's a 3-dimensional representation of individual ancestry proportions and constitutive pigmentation values in African Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Mexicans. And you can see the variation in this. Off the two-dimensional plane is the density of melanin measured in these individuals. And you have the corners demarcating the indigenous or Native American population, European and Western African ancestry of these individuals. And there really is no clumping of the phenotypes. They're spread without or in a fashion that would suggest a more clinal or gradual distribution. So that's a representation of physical traits of race. Now, the geography of race starts, to the best of our knowledge, in East and Southeast Africa. And anthropologists estimate between 50 to 200,000 years humans had been kind of developing in Africa, and then there's this theory of the out of Africa theory, meaning that migrations began populating other areas of the earth, and through using mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosomal DNA, they were able to guesstimate the genetic distance from ground zero out of Africa into Ethiopia. And you can see that there was migration. The first migration occurred through the Indian Ocean, the south coast of India, into the Malaysian islands. And then there was migration then up into Asia. And from Asia, there was migration into Europe, and then further through Asia, and then across the Bering Bridge about 15 to 35,000 years ago. So the out of Africa event, let's say 150,000 years ago, and then people onto the American continents about 15 to 35,000 years ago. And as you can imagine, this was fraught with movement and Malthusian events of starvation and war, infestation, et cetera, that would affect gene flow and admixtures. But all of that would have, again, a clinal aspect to it, or a gradual aspect to it, and not, and there is no evidence of an isolated geographic group with isolated genotype in our history, or in a way that science could find this out. So we essentially don't have evidence of a geographic isolation. We don't have evidence of necessary and necessary and sufficient findings of physical traits. Thank you. I have a word finding issue. Now, this is modern population movement, which I found very interesting. You can isolate a country or a continent or an area. And let's take Europe. You can see that there's intermigration and there's external migration into Europe. There's not a whole lot of migration out of Europe, little strip there, but there's about 10,000 or 10 million people that have either moved in or moved out of Europe from 2005 to 2010. And you can analyze this for other continents and areas. Just an example of how gene flow and admixtures of genes are likely exchanged. Now, we'll get into this a little bit more later, but there may be social isolation of reproduction in these movements, you know, based on religion or culture, et cetera. And that is a little bit of a hurdle to my thesis, but not much, I don't think. Okay, so these are just comments about genetics and ancestry, because the literature is teeming now. It's accelerating since the Human Genome Project finished its work in 2002. And there's been so much concentration in genotyping and omics, not just genomics, but proteomics and metabolomics, which can affect our ability to perceive racial issues or to address racial issues. One part of science that is really interesting is epigenetics, and especially transgenerational epigenetics. I don't know if you've been reading about this, but there's a suggestion that reproductive gametes can undergo genetic changes that don't affect the structure of the genotype or the chromosomes, but it affects the expression of the gene material based on what's called methylation or histone protein manipulation in the setting of environmental stress. And so not only can environmental stress affect the expression of the genes in the same individual, but it's possible, and this is in its infancy, that it could be transmitted through generations, which would be a significant scientific finding to bolster an argument that an African coming from West Africa to Chicago, not only will that individual express, for example, hypertension in where if they had stayed in West Africa, they would not have expressed hypertension, and this is based on data. But they may transmit that propensity for hypertension to generations beyond. A typical human genome is 3 billion base pairs. We have 23 chromosomes. It's interesting, only about 20,000 proteins are coded by human genes. So a lot of base pairs lie fallow or have some inactive property, perhaps over time may become active. I certainly don't know this, and I'm not sure even those that are experts in the field know exactly what the excess base pairs or genomes, the full role that they play. Ancestry science, from blood typing to mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome assessment. These have been historic informative markers for ancestry. But then there's also multiple single nucleotide changes within base pairs, SNPs, that are assayed and compared to the patterns of known people from, say, Africa or Europe or Asia, or whatever group that you want to define, et cetera. They're helpful, I think, to a certain extent, but here's the thing about ancestry genes is they're not linked to physiologic or anatomy genes. They're not expressed in proteins. So yeah, you get kind of some sense of what continent you're from, but you don't have a sense of your propensity to get hypertension or to develop sickle cell anemia or cystic fibrosis. that becomes a probability issue, which I'll get to in a second. Genetic variability is greater between individuals within Africa. And this probably exists because the gene flow within Africa has occurred over tens of thousands of years more than gene flow has outside of Africa. You know, we have this genetic distance that occurs throughout the world from Africa. And with less time, there's less admixture. And within Africa, you're going to see between individuals more variation in genetic material or genotyping than you see between an African and somebody not from Africa. Then finally, we have scientific evidence for a shared demographic origin originating in East Africa. The only true statement of the natural scientific statement of race would be we're all African from Ethiopia, perhaps. And first of all, that negates any race taxonomy because you have to have more than one race. But also it suggests that if you observe nature with an open mind as far as you can take it to what we know now, you know, humans have evolved from an area in Africa, and everything beyond that has been genetic flow, adaptation to the sun, close or far away from the equator, and other soft tissue issues that may affect adaptation or not. So that's the best attempt I have with trying to show that the science of race, which is based a lot on the work of Naomi Zak, it's just non-existent. We can't say there's evidence for a demarcation of race in nature. And so then that brings us back to our thesis. Medicine considers natural race as necessary and foundational in its practices. I think they've made statements to justify that. Medicine gives scientific credence to race in some of the practices. I think that I've shown that in our talk. And race cannot play a scientific role in human physiology or disease because it doesn't exist in nature. So medicine would be ontologically and epistemologically, that I can't spell, justified to eliminate race from its scientific practices. I've tried to stay away from what they should do or what we should do. This is what is, what's observational, and what, you know, would be justified or not justified. Trying to stay away from the murky environment of what should happen based on the information if one agrees with this. Now, the real issue is in what we should do, right? And that gets murky. That, to me, I've taken this on kind of as a project, and this is like part one of the project, and I'd like to take this on as a project. Part two being the anti-realist aspects of race and what that is and how it could be manipulated to be beneficial to medical science.
Sorry, James, you're behind the schedule and we want to have time for discussion as well. So
yeah, fine. Okay. I'll leave the translational work up to this is what I think we can do.
okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. We'll discuss for about 10 minutes and then take 5 minutes break and then go to the next talk with a 5-minute delay. So yeah, please.
Oh, this is very careful of you. So, okay, I want to just, I mean, maybe I would not want to say something because my presentations actually is very, would be very interesting, like a counter represent, yeah. But
Big group.
yeah, of course, it's good. So you think race is useless in medicine, so we cannot justify race in medicine, but
No, I wanted to stay away from that. I
You wanna-
presented all this data.
you said that it's not justifiable.
That's-
We should not justify it, right?
We, I guess, should, I'm not saying we should or shouldn't. I say it would be justified based on what I've presented to eliminate. I'm not saying that they should eliminate. And
You are not saying that it has to be eliminated? No, and
so
so,
I try to stay at just what it is and isn't.
so it's not your claim, this is not your thesis, so, okay. No, because, yeah, I agree with you with, okay,
I
you.
understand where you're going.
Yeah, I mean, you, yeah, you presented some arguments to say, I mean, that so we have to forget genetic ancestry if we want to use it as a proxy for some genetic characteristics that can, I mean, they are supposed to cause some, biological differences between races, right? And I agree with you. Yeah, because.
That gets into what we ought to do.
Or that you cannot found the race on genetic ancestry. I mean, I agree with all you said, okay. But then you talked about epigenetics, for example, no? Epigenetics, and also transgenerational epigenetics. So I thought, okay, why don't you think that we can use maybe, epigenetic differences as maybe possible potential causes of, I don't know, differences in lung function, observed differences in lung function between races. I don't know. So different kind of, so not genetic differences, but epigenetic differences or a variation in gene environment interaction to explain such, different biological differences we observed, no? Because, it would be, I think about the differences, for example, in preterm birth, in the rate of preterm birth between African-American pregnant women and white women in the United States. And so I will make this example in my presentation. So this is about clinical practice. So if I'm a physician and an African-American pregnant woman comes to the hospital and she's like, let's say, I don't know, 25 weeks pregnant and with some pain, I think I cannot ignore this evidence. I cannot ignore that the rate of a preterm birth is much, much higher in this category, right? So race would be useful for me as a physician in my clinical practice. So I think maybe we can, see different contexts and explore different explanatory frameworks. And so this is.
So my goal is not to eliminate the use of race in a pragmatic and contextual fashion, because I think race would be considered a social group and a reproductive group, more so than it is a physiologic or causal variable in human medicine. Does that make sense in that, so you could take a group of Ashkenazi Jews that essentially reproduce more so within their group, and you could see some genetic linkage and linkage disequilibrium of traits occurring over generations that would predispose them to Tay-Sachs disease.
Yeah, but this is not a race, right? It's just an isolated population.
It's cultural norms, religion, And in the end, they reproduce amongst themselves more than within other groups, with other groups. It doesn't mean they're isolated. And to create, say, a biologic basis for a subspecies. They're just another social group, African American group, the Irish, Czechs and Chinese and Protestants and Catholics and Jews, and
I think, yeah, I mean, sorry,
Okay,
I mean,
sorry.
I isolated genetically because for the inbreeding, for cultural reason,
Right.
there was this inbreeding in this kind of Ashkenazi population.
They're not isolated to a fashion that it predicts the necessary and sufficient event. It creates probabilities of disease. And my argument would be to address race. Let's say, are you in a physician?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, what we do is like, kind of a early medical school thing is learn how to take a history. And race traditionally has been considered in the first sentence. This 39-year-old African-American female has thus and thus. This is their history. If I were looking at that, I would say that all of these parameters, that the age, the sex, et cetera, they could stay there, but I would take race down and I would put it in their social history or their family history. And I would say the family has ancestry in West Africa, or et cetera, et cetera. And that would create a social.
But you would take the race anyway.
In that sense, but I think race is an anomalous proxy for something that's more basic, a principle that's more basic. So you wouldn't need to say race. You just say their genetic foundation comes from West Africa, or it comes from Ireland for cystic fibrosis, let's say, et cetera, et cetera. Those would all give scientific hints to where you should look as a clinician without needing race. Race, may or may not be adequate for that. Okay, sorry.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm actually gonna, this is a finger on Ludovica's question, because I was actually also confused with respect to your response to Ludovica, because on the slides, you said there's no causal role for race in medicine. And I think what some people are having an issue with is the reason why you seem to be saying that is because you take yourself to have established that there's no biological classification of race that has a causal role in medicine, but it doesn't follow from that there's no classification of race that has no causal role in medicine. And there are plenty of philosophers of medicine, Ludovica being one, and critical race theorists like Dorothy Roberts have argued that even if there isn't any biological race, there's still a causal role in medicine for non-biological, socially constructed racial classifications. Now, in that last response, it sounded almost as though you did want to go a step further and say, well, there's not even a social causal role for race in medicine, because the way that we use the term race, it's a sort of jumbled proxy for something that is going to be more precise and causally involved. And there are some philosophers who have argued that, like Alex Tobert, who has a whole scale sort of criticism of even socially constructed racial classifications, not just in medicine, but in social science. He published this in Philosophy of Science last year, on the grounds that what we think are the causal roles of race, even in a social context, are really confounding. And when you sort of disaggregate, you see that the causal role is something else. So he's actually not an anti-realist about race, he's an agnostic. Now, you know, you could go either way with that. But, yeah, like that's kind of like the anti-realist road. But, so I'm just a little confused as to what you're trying to convince us of. Are you trying to convince us that race has no causal role in medicine, period, or race as sort of biologically classified as no causal role in medicine?
So it's a great discussion and question. Thank you. I believe that race, if race plays a significant role in medicine, it primarily would play it in clinical medicine, not scientific, not science. First of all, because the clinical medicine being the application of biologic scientific findings, it needs to be pragmatic and contextual. So I'm going to look at an individual and I'm going to think about racial issues because I don't have all the other information. I don't have the personal genetic genotypes of this individual. So I don't know if they're going to be prone to hypertension or not, but I know that African Americans, 60% of them as adults will have hypertension, as opposed to 35% of European or white Americans. All of those things go into my calculation as a clinician, but I don't think there's a causal role necessarily to that, because if I had the time, I would look at this individual as an African American, and I would say, I know from the literature, at least that I understand from lung medicine, that if you take the socioeconomic stress factors and you normalize those in your study, you take everyone, let's say, take the same socioeconomic stress factors, you have a certain array of African Americans, whites, with the socioeconomic stress factor of 1 and another of 5 with different races. The socioeconomic stress factor is the cause. Their environmental exposure, their proximity to a grocery store, their developmental things that, you know, we know from healthcare that African Americans don't get prenatal and perinatal care as well as, say, the white group, and that's going to affect their lung function from the moment they're born, and then their environment and socioeconomic stress is going to diminish the development of their lung function, and then over time maybe contribute to further deterioration of lung function. So if you take a group of African Americans, their lung function is lower than white Americans, and that's going to be consistent. But that finding is confounded or underdetermined by socioeconomic status, and that's what's coming out in the literature. In lung medicine, the same with kidney disorder. They've already gotten rid of race equations. They're ahead of pulmonary. Because
already over time, so let's squeeze one more
Oh.
question and then, yeah, look at slide, please.
Thanks, Hannah. Thanks, Jim. So I'm gonna, sorry. So 2 things. One is, but I don't think really this is a criticism of your conclusion. I think in your syllogism, I think you in the end fundamentally mischaracterize what medicine is or should be.
Okay.
So you could run your syllogism for lots of things, right? You could run it for socioeconomic status. You could run it for being a surgeon if we investigate high mortality rates among surgeons, right? You could say, well, I mean, SES can't play a scientific role in human physiology or disease because it doesn't exist in nature. Being a surgeon can't play a role in explaining disease because it doesn't exist. Being an asbestos worker, I mean, that is a social. So,
Yeah.
and I think,
But they're not, related.
no, but that doesn't matter. So your argument doesn't really, I mean, your argument proves far too much than it would want to prove, because it would prove that all of these things, it would be justified to eliminate from scientific practice. Right? Because your argument is going to work for all of them.
Pretty good. Try to.
Yeah, medicine considers natural science necessary and foundational, gives scientific credence to SES, socioeconomic status, and some of its practices. Socioeconomic status can't play a scientific role in human physiology because, like, socioeconomic status doesn't exist in nature, right? We don't find it in we only find it in human societies. Being a surgeon is something we only find in human societies. So I think you being somebody who works on lofts with pulling out all the asbestos is something we only find in the context of like human culture.
Right.
So all of those things are not going to be found in nature in the sort of way you're looking at nature as like, you know, in the genes or in the, and so all of those would be eliminable. How would you find being a surgeon in nature?
No, well, let's take, coal miner.
Coal miner. Yeah, I mean, we could go on and on.
It's exposed to.
Yeah, but somebody, but somebody
And
who's,
that has a correlation.
yeah, and a surgeon is exposed to stress and late nights. And a black person is opposed to structural racism, right? So how is being, and bad housing, right? The asbestos person is
Right,
exposed
but
to,
it's
and-
the bad housing and not. the
I
color
agree.
of the skin, right?
but I'm just saying, your argument applies for all of those cases. So you have to look very carefully whether this is really the right argument to use. But I was also going to say something really constructive. So in the UK, well, something more encouraging. No, I was going to now say something encouraging because I think you said something really profound that is related to these questions about like being attuned to clinical medicine and being practically relevant, right? When you said this thing like the standard way of describing clinical cases is, you know, a 20-year-old white woman. And so you're immediately like, could possibly be pregnancy, is not menopausal, is probably menstruating or using contraceptives, probably not a heart attack of sustaining chest. All these inferences start rolling, right? That's how you're taught to do medicine. And in fact, I believe that in the UK, there are standards ways of examining medicine called a single best answer system. They have strict guides for how you write them. And I think they lay down, I don't know, this would be worth looking into whether they do lay down race, but they definitely, you have to describe things because these people come in with like gender issues. You have to describe things as 34-year-old male. That's just the standard start of the question otherwise. And I think you make a really quite profound comment that insofar as all of these issues we discussed are relevant, they are fundamentally misplaced in the first sentence. So age is okay in the first sentence. Sex is okay in the first sentence. And there are lots of other things. Are you an asbestos worker? Are you a surgeon?
Right.
What is which part of Glasgow do you live in? Right. But they're all in the more nuanced, like you say, history taking. And in the history taking, there may well be room for thinking about, you know, ancestry and thinking about, but it seems that something really wrong of having it in that first sentence. And that strikes us like a really correct and quite precise and direct point. And I think that corresponds really to all the concerns that we all have and raise. We probably all agree on that, actually. Like, yes, it shouldn't be in that first line, but it may well be in other parts of the history with all those other relevant more nuanced things.
Thank you very much, Aslan. We have 20 minutes over time, so let's continue this discussion over some coffee. We'll come back in 5 minutes for the last one.
Good coffee now, or?
I promise it's good, yeah.
Pastries, though, let me put in a good word for the pastries. The pastries are very